Okay, now we're going to talk about the world. You're going to be my Dr. Strangelove, okay, on all the bad things. But before I get there, let me start with you, Samir. One of the questions as you sort of look at cyber defense or cyber offense as well is what kind of norms are evolving in the international system that you think matter? I mean, you did this for Barack Obama and Susan Rice. You were out there trying to do smart policy in cyber. So I'm interested in what some of the features of those norms are and whether or not you feel that we're succeeding in evolving towards them.
I think it's a mixed picture. I think we've made some progress at the UN and in sort of our multilateral and bilateral relationships where there's been some consensus on norms around not attacking critical infrastructure or there's some agreements.
Do you believe that? I mean, do you believe that the states that are participating are not attacking each other's critical infrastructure?
I mean, you have to differentiate between state actors, sort of cutouts, people who are sort of affiliated with states versus and cyber criminals. I think there's a lot of what I would call preparation, so that people are positioning, the nation states are positioning themselves so that in the event of a conflict or something like that, they would be in position, so that they may be positioning malware.
So that's a mutual assured destruction thing?
Almost like that. But I think even as we've made some progress, and it's been halting, and the UN group of government experts this year wasn't able to agree on additional norms. I think the flip side of that, and where we're having a lot of trouble, is figuring out, even if we get agreement on some norms, how do we enforce them? In other words, what's the punishment or the consequence if you don't, in fact, obey that norm? And I don't think we've figured that out yet.
When did you leave the White House?
In January.
Did you punish anybody?
I think we did in some sense. I mean, we imposed sanctions, for example, against certain Russian actors in December in light of
Did that feel good?
It felt good. Was it effective? I mean, did it accomplish a lot? I'm not sure.
Andrea, you have the portfolio here in Washington representing the EU, which must be a complicated task, representing all those countries. How do you feel the norm building is going on, at least in the transatlantic relationship?
Well, I think transatlantically, first of all, if you allow me, we do not represent member states. Each member state is its own embassy here. We represent the union within its competencies, which include indeed a lot of the cybersecurity stuff that we're talking about. I think that transatlantically there is actually quite a bit of agreement between the US and the European Union and its member states. And you can see that in the discussion in the UN with some differences. I mean, France can disagree from time to time, and that's okay. So I don't think there is any particular stuff that we really disagree on. In fact, I would argue that with this new administration, cyber is probably the area where we find most continuity, mostly because as far as you can see, for the time being at least, the work of the current administration is very much a continuation of the work of the previous administration. So from our perspective, from that point of view, we don't see any major problem. The only, diplomatically I shouldn't say it, but perhaps concern that we have is that right now it's slightly difficult to find the counterparts in the administration that we talk to.
Who do you deal with? Like, who's your interlocutor?
But, at the State Department just recently, there was the appointment of the Assistant Secretary for, there was a merge of the previous digital economy and cyber position in the State Department, so we now have that interlocutor, whom I met, is great. We now have a new, at least appointed Secretary for Homeland Security. So we kind of have the counterparts, but certainly I think that we are still waiting for the full picture to form the administration.
Have you thought that you might have continuity because there's nobody been appointed to undo what the Obama administration did?
No, that's not what I said. No, actually, no, jokes aside, there is actually a very affirmative action by the current administration, which was the executive order by the White House back in May, I think. That is the policy of the White House and the federal government as far as we can tell on cybersecurity. And if you look at that executive order, which for the time being is very much about reviewing the internal preparedness of the federal government, and also, that's of course very interesting for us, preparing the international cyber engagement strategy of the US government. If you look at that executive order, what is on paper as opposed to the various drafts that were leaked from January until May, that executive order is very much in continuity as far as we can tell with the work of the previous administration.
So Gordon, I'm grossly simplifying what I just heard, but norms are evolving, structures are coming in, warm and fuzzy, sounds good. Dr. Strangelove, do you see the world the same way?
Well, while diplomats at the UN are busy continuing a discussion about norms, perhaps not as effectively as they should, and in Europe the conversation continues, while that dialogue diplomatically is going on, the great cyber game is being played, and it's being played with enormous intensity. And I would argue that we have reached an inflection point in the past 6 months that should give all of us pause. In May, those of you who were tracking the news observed that 200,000 computers in 150 countries around the world were infected with a virus called the WannaCry virus. It shut down hospitals, rail links, and production lines. The Department of Homeland Security attributed that to North Korea. The following month, in June, there was a hack in Ukraine. It hit 2,000 targets and eventually spread to 65 different countries. And Ukraine attributed the attack to Russia. What we now know is that those cyber weapons, those offensive cyber weapons, were stolen from the United States, from the National Security Agency, from our cyber command.
So if the NSA is getting hacked, what chance of survival do we have, right? So,
as one of those movie titles said, be afraid, be very afraid. If the dominant cyber power in the world, which I believe the United States still is, competing with China and Russia and Iran and North Korea, if the dominant cyber power in the United States cannot safeguard its own offensive cyber weapons, and they end up in the hands of third parties and then in the hands of rival nation states, how much progress are we making in alleviating the threats of the global cyber risk environment? I think this is an extraordinarily important kind of epical moment in how the game is played.
I had no idea how dark you could be, but I'm impressed.
Playing to tight.
You know, no, but I think in this area, when we're looking at the ecosystem, one of the things that's happened recently, I've had the privilege of talking to Ambassador Mike Rogers of the NSA, who's dual-hatted. So he's head of the National Security Agency and also head of the Cyber Command, which is now a full combatant command. We have some folks from there here. You know, he's talked a lot about, you know, in the world of norms, almost trying to figure out how you get back to a system of deterrence, how you create, you know, it sounds like a more punitive side, but how do you bring back some of the risk-reward dimension or punishment reward dimension of this? And Samir, I know you've thought about this in terms of policy framework, and you know, is it achievable? Because you just mentioned North Korea and Russia, two countries of vastly different resources in this arena. What should be shocking is North Korea. I can't believe North Korea can penetrate. I mean, how does North Korea do it? It's the most cut-off nation in the world, and yet somehow it has extraordinary capacity. What would you do? I mean, how do you fix this?
I mean, look, I agree that in the foreseeable future, the cyber problem in many respects is going to get worse before it gets better, because I think the attack surface is growing, the number of actors who are able and willing to engage in cyber attacks is increasing, and frankly, we haven't seen some of the worst kinds of cyber attacks that we could. So I think we're very much at the beginning stages.
What are those?
So I mean, we haven't seen many cyber attacks yet that have physical consequences. We saw, you know, the attack on the Ukraine power grid. We've seen, you know, ransomware that has some effect on hospitals, but we haven't really seen major attacks, you know, dams being taken over and the sluice gates being opened and causing flooding downstream, which is very possible. And we haven't seen attacks that, what I would call attacks on data integrity, so that instead of stealing information or denying access to information through ransomware, someone goes in, you know, to a financial system and adds a 0 to a trading order or deletes a 0, or goes into a hospital system and changes the dosing information for patients. And so, you know, you get changes in the integrity of the information, it's not recognized, and people act on that, and you have an undermining of confidence in the whole system, you know, the financial system.
What about the Securities and Exchange Commission hack and Edgar? You don't think that somebody may have gone in and shifted information here and there inside Edgar?
It's certainly possible. I mean, there's, as far as I know, no public indication that that happened, but yeah, that would be a possible. I mean, but that's the kind of attack that I'm talking about in terms of one way in which this is going to get worse before it gets better. And I think, look, I mean, I think one of the things that we tried to do, and I think this administration is continuing, is to recognize that in order to tackle the cyber problem, to increase deterrence, you really have to look at all tools of government. In other words, a cyber attack can't simply be responded to on a cyber level. You have to look at, you know, whether it's sanctions or other economic measures, diplomacy, law enforcement, And all of these different tools have to be brought to bear. Are we there yet in terms of achieving deterrence? Clearly not.
Can I jump in on this question? You've identified the seminal question: how do you reinforce our cybersecurity program, our cybersecurity strategy, with an element of deterrence which has been lacking? And some of our best thinkers in the U.S. foreign policy community are really focusing on this now. Joe Nye, the professor at Harvard, who's been one of the leading political scientists of his or any generation, has just written a tremendous article on deterrence and dissuasion in cyberspace, which students of the field I recommend it to you. One can argue that to some degree there is an element of deterrence. The big threat that people have been worried about for 10 years was that preemptive attack on our critical infrastructure. Richard Clarke wrote a book 10 years ago imagining a preemptive cyber attack that would take down our power grid, that would have planes flying into each other, that would be blowing up power plants and so forth. Happily, that has not passed. But while the most severe risks have not materialized, the most pervasive risks have only grown, and they've grown exponentially. And they're the kind of attacks that are below preemptive war, below an attack on critical infrastructure, and it's industrial espionage, it's stealing of our intelligence secrets, and it's this massive problem of global cybercrime, which some estimates say is $750 to $1 trillion a year, $750 billion to $1 trillion. So there's this great irony. We've avoided the worst outcome, but the most pervasive ones we've not mitigated.
Andrea, let me ask you to take off your EU hat for a minute, and you know.
I can't.
But I'm interested in how, in having an offshore perspective of us. When you look at what Russia has done with hybrid war in places like Ukraine and elsewhere, what's happened and whatnot, do you look at the United States as slightly befuddled, uncertain? I mean, how do you look at the American, both private sector and public sector, response to some of the things happening in the world? And are you worried?
So first of all, I'm not sure we would like to be called an offshore center of anything, but besides that, so you're asking for my personal view, and that's what I'm going to offer you, so this is not the official EU position. I think that the way I certainly look at the Americans after more than 3 years here is that I find you guys a bit naive, to be completely blunt and honest, in the sense that the kind of hybrid warfare that people are alleging has happened here in the US is something that is very familiar to us in Europe for decades. It's not anything new. And independently of who actually is behind those alleged attacks, and by the way, I would also like to point out that when we talk about norms and in all this discussion, let's not forget that attribution is still very difficult. Any country can claim that another country is conducting an attack, and that doesn't mean that that country, and whether that country is the US or Russia or a European country, etc., let's keep that in mind. So there is that. Secondly, I think that we should not keep in mind that this is not so much an American issue. I think it's an advanced economies issue, so it's European and American. The reason why the WannaCry, one of the reasons why the WannaCry virus that Gordon has mentioned was so effective is because 99% of the systems that were attacked with that particular virus were unpatched for a vulnerability that had been known for years. So there are geopolitical issues, there are state actors that are moving there, so it is a dangerous environment, but let's not forget that a lot of what we're talking about is unfortunately the baseline of very common cyber hygiene is very low, and this is true in the US as it is in Europe. I would argue, as a European in this wonderful country, you have perhaps a slightly even worse problems because your IT penetration is slightly higher than in Europe. It depends on the European country, actually, but by and large, you have IT systems penetrating the internet or whatever, penetrating into your core infrastructure at an even higher degree than you can find in Europe and other countries, and in this way you're more vulnerable. But again, let me underline that, yes, there are kind of state-level geopolitical issues, we need to address those, but there are also very basic issues of patching, of basic security that are not being addressed.
And this problem is going to get worse because with the advent of the Internet of Things and the spread of connected devices through homes, factories, and the like, in which it's not clear that the incentives are there to actually integrate security even to the same level that you have in the rest of the infrastructure. I think this problem of basic cyber hygiene is going to get worse.
How is there not the incentives there to embed an Internet of Things environment when you have companies like Cisco or Accenture or Microsoft and others that provide the capillaries and the system for some of this to work. I hear this thing about there not being enough incentives. What are the right incentives to get it? I mean, it just sounds crazy to me.
First and foremost, I would say that because it is a very complex environment, and we should not forget that, we should not be too quick to attribute responsibility to companies which are trying, whether they're American, European, or from elsewhere, they're trying to do their best by and large. But the environment is complex. From our perspective, and here I'm putting back the EU hat because this is an official position / reflection that we are conducting in Europe, the attribution of liability is not at all clear. When something goes wrong, who is liable? And as we're moving towards an Internet of Things world in which you have a toaster which is connected to the internet to understand when at what time, and by the way, it's probably connected to my tracker to understand at what time I'm waking up, whether that morning I want white bread or black bread or whatever. If something goes wrong, and if that toaster is used, for example, for a distributed denial of service attack, and this is not science fiction, this is what happened with the Mirai botnet 1 year ago, more or less. Who is responsible? Is it the toaster producer? Is it the tracker producer? Is it whomever has been handling the data, processing of data, communication of data? Until we manage to come to some clarity on who has liability there, and there are various ways in which we can do it, and we have our own ideas, but they're not necessarily the right ideas. The problem is that companies will never, rationally speaking, no company will ever invest money into something until they're told, if you don't do that, there is going to be a cost for that.
This is a critical question, and I'm going to play the type for you because I know you'll like it. I hosted a meeting at the Council on Foreign Relations last spring. The title of it was, "Will the Internet of Things be a cybersecurity disaster?" And the question is, the question is not a facetious question. It's a real question. There are 1 billion additional connected devices every quarter. Every quarter, 1 billion additional connected devices are connecting to the internet. And we have not had this difficult discussion about how we're going to achieve the basic modicum of safety and protection in that evolving
And what's
world.
important, I think, is that as you get all these devices out there, it's not simply that those devices are targets in and of themselves, but they can be weaponized and used essentially as weapons against the rest of the infrastructure, which is what happened with the Mirai botnet. So it has an exponential effect on the problems of security.
Just before I go to the audience, I want to ask you quickly about China. If we were doing this event 2 years ago, China would dominate the discussion. Now we're talking about a lot of other countries. And Samir, I know you were involved in the Xi Jinping-Obama discussion on establishing norms and getting China to back off, whether it has or not. I think you're in a slightly different. You believe that China's been a good player, a good behavior, ought to get a gold star.
Well, I'm not sure I would go that far.
Okay.
I think it's...
You go partly there, right?
Partly there.
Yeah.
I think it's true that if you look at...
Purple star.
If you look at the amount of, cyber-enabled IP theft, which was the main focus of that agreement, that China or Chinese actors have engaged in, that has been reduced. And I think the government has said that, but I think also third-party cybersecurity firms, private cybersecurity firms, CrowdStrikes of the world and whatnot, have seen a reduction. Does that mean they've stopped? Absolutely not. Does that mean they couldn't increase? I actually think what they've done is become more strategic. In other words, I think previously what happened is that there was sort of whatever we can hack, we will hack, whereas now there's a little bit more control and more strategy, and they're more strategic about what it is that they're hacking. So
it's not a good story.
Can I jump in on this? And I didn't know I could do that, but I will take off again my EU hat and offer a personal perspective.
I love it when you do that.
This is great. Yeah, no, I love it too. There are many things I would like to say that I cannot say because of the EU hat. So, look, personal observation. I think it's important and very much related to what you asked me before. How do non-Americans see what's happening here in the US? Let's not forget that, and by the way, the European Union and China have deep disagreements on many, many, many issues. I don't think we can be defined as friends, and I want that to be clear. But I think it's important for the US public and for US policymakers to understand that outside of the US, it is actually the US that is most often considered to be the worst offender when it comes to cyber attacks and cyber espionage and all this kind of stuff, which, by the way, personally, I believe all countries do that. And when we look at this from an international relation perspective, let's not forget cyber is not different from this point of view from any other policy in the international environment. States are selfish actors. They will do what they believe is strategically best for them. And so in a way, I think that sometimes in the debate here in the US, there is a little bit, China is so bad because it's doing this, this, and this. if you were in their situation, you would probably do the same. I think that attributing morality to actions of states and international environment is not a good way to address the real and concrete concerns that, by the way, the US and Europe together have vis-a-vis the behavior of China in the cyber environment.
Gordon?
Well, I don't disagree with that, and I do believe we live in a realist world of significantly evolving cyber threats. What's interesting, though, is to look at the primary cyber actors and to try to assess their geopolitical incentive structure. And I think of your comment about China, they've emphasized going after intellectual property, they've emphasized espionage. But we haven't seen any evidence that I'm aware of that they've tried to penetrate into our actual political institutions with the intensity and methodical aggression and audacity as Russia has purportedly done. And it's interesting to look from a US perspective, the threats vary from different cyber actors. And for Vladimir Putin, who is ostensibly trying to undermine the cohesion of our democratic institutions and the cohesion of the Western alliance, it's a different set of incentives than it is from looking from Beijing, which has other goals.
Thank you. Let's go to you. Questions, thoughts, right here in front. We have a mic. Oh. Thank you so much. I'll give you a round of applause for all the running. Hi.
Oh,
it's Takeo, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Hi, my name is Takeo McCullough. My question really is for you, Andrea. Can you speak a little bit to GDPR or the General Data Privacy Regulation that the EU just is actually about to implement in this coming May, and where that lies in the establishment of the cyber frontier between the EU versus the rest of the world?
Thank you. And I'm going to ask for short form so we can get a couple real fast. Sure. Yeah.
So should I
Yeah,
say?
please.
Yeah. Look, very briefly, the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, is the law of the land in the EU since last year, if I remember correctly. Indeed, it will become enforceable as of May 2018. I think that what really matters in terms of non-European actors is that there is a provision in the GDPR, which, by the way, we believe it was always from a jurisprudential point of view, was always the case, but now it's statutorily put in the law, that if you handle, if you do business with Europeans, if you handle data of Europeans, then that European law should apply.
Thank you. Yes, right in the middle.
Oh, that was fast. We can perhaps talk more about this later.
Right there. Yes.
Wow.
Hi, I'm Nicole Carlin. I'm with the Internet Society, and my question is, if you could talk to the people negotiating NAFTA right now, what big opportunity would you insist that they talk to their colleagues about?
So NAFTA and the net.
I'm going to pass that off.
Samir?
I mean, I'm not a NAFTA expert, so, but, you know, I think the question of sort of trans-border data flows is an important one, and, you know, it's something that could be dealt with in NAFTA. I know it was sort of an issue in the TPP that was eventually, that we were pulled out of. So I think thinking through sort of those kinds of issues, you know, whether it's done in the context of NAFTA or otherwise, is sort of an important
Question. I saw another hand. Oh, in the very back.
And that was NAFTA in 20 seconds. So.
Hi, Mark Batenchuk from Scope Group. We are the only cybersecurity recruiting company in the DC metro area. And so one of the things that I always like to try to do is look around the corner. You all are experts, and as we wrap up this great presentation, can you guys give us a little insight as to what we all might be talking about in a year, what the topics might be 1 year from now?
Gordon?
In the industry?
So as someone who's a participant in this space, you're familiar with the proposition that the reason why the cybersecurity threat is so acute is because offense is much stronger than defense. And in the effort to kind of craft a strategy to deal with it, we talk about advances in technology. One of them is machine learning, and perhaps that could be very meaningful. The other is the cloud. I think we'll be talking about that on defense. But our antagonists are incredibly resourceful as well, and they're going to apply the tools of machine learning as well. So this oscillation between offensive advantage and defensive response, I think, is going to escalate and become increasingly sophisticated.
And with that, I want to thank Andrea Glorioso, who occasionally represents the delegation of the European Union, Samir, Jain with Jones Day, and Gordon Goldstein with Silver Lake and the Council on Foreign Relations. Thank you so much.